For 10,000 cycles, the galaxy had been stable. Not peaceful, never peaceful, but stable. Every species knew its place. Every conflict had boundaries. Every advancement followed patterns that the Galactic Council had long ago learned to predict, contain, and if necessary, suppress. Power flowed in controlled currents, never chaotic, never unexpected. The Council itself was older than most civilizations it governed. Its members represented species that had survived extinction thresholds, technological singularities, and interstellar wars. They had seen every variation of ambition. Expansionist empires, hive minds, machine collectives, nothing surprised them anymore. Every new species was assessed, categorized, and placed into the structure with clinical precision. So when humanity was discovered, it did not trigger alarm. At first glance, they were unimpressive. A single planet species with fragmented governance, conflicting ideologies, and a history filled with internal conflict. Their technology was functional but crude by galactic standards. Their communication systems were inefficient. Their political structures were unstable. Their biology was unremarkable. The initial classification was immediate and unanimous. Non-threatening. Their file was thin. Their projected impact negligible. Their future predictable. Observers noted their tendency toward cooperation, but it was dismissed as primitive social bonding. Their aggression was recorded, but categorized as internalized and self-limiting. Their innovation rate showed irregular spikes, but those were attributed to randomness rather than design. To the Council, humanity was not a threat. It was noise. Still, protocol demanded observation. So watchers were assigned, quiet, distant, thorough. They monitored human broadcasts, studied their development, mapped their behavior across decades. What they found did not concern them, but it did confuse them. Humans contradicted themselves constantly. They built systems, then dismantled them. They cooperated, then competed. They solved problems in ways that ignored efficiency but achieved results anyway. Their progress was uneven, yet somehow forward-moving. They lacked unity, yet acted with surprising cohesion under pressure. One report described them as inconsistent to the point of instability. Another described them as adaptable beyond predictive modeling. The Council chose to believe the first. When humanity reached the threshold of interstellar communication, contact was initiated. It was not a grand moment. No ceremony, no revelation. Just a transmission, clean, controlled, deliberate. Humanity responded quickly. Too quickly. Their reply was not refined, not aligned with standard first contact protocols. It was fragmented, emotional, layered with multiple voices. Questions overlapped with greetings. Curiosity overshadowed caution. They did not present themselves as a unified front. The Council interpreted this as weakness. Integration began shortly after. Humanity was granted limited access, controlled trade routes, restricted knowledge exchange, monitored diplomatic channels. Nothing dangerous. Nothing transformative. Enough to guide them, not enough to empower them. They accepted. Without protest. That, more than anything, reinforced the Council's conclusion. Compliant species were predictable species. Yet the observers continued their reports, and the inconsistencies persisted. Humans asked unusual questions. Not about power structures or technological shortcuts, but about limitations. They probed boundaries instead of opportunities. They showed interest in systems not as they were, but as they could fail. They studied everything. Not openly. Not aggressively. But thoroughly. They engaged with other species in ways that didn't follow established hierarchies. They formed connections where none were expected. Minor exchanges, insignificant interactions, yet they accumulated. Patterns began to emerge. Not large enough to trigger concern. Not clear enough to define. But present. A junior analyst flagged the anomaly. The report was concise, almost hesitant. Human behavior does not align with projected compliance curves. It was reviewed, acknowledged, and archived. Because from the Council's perspective, there was nothing to worry about. Humanity was still contained within its parameters, still dependent on controlled systems, still operating below any threshold that mattered. They had no fleets worth noting, no unified command, no leverage. They were, by every measurable standard, insignificant. And yet, in observation logs that few bothered to read, a different picture was forming. Not of strength, not of dominance, but of something less familiar. A species that did not behave according to expectation. A species that learned without announcing it. A species that accepted limitations without internalizing them. The Council did not see it. Not fully. Not yet. But one observer, assigned to long-term behavioral analysis, recorded a final note after reviewing a century of human activity. There was no alarm in the statement. No urgency. Just quiet uncertainty. They are not reacting like a species that understands its place. The restrictions were subtle by design. No declarations, no visible force, just limitations woven into every exchange. Trade routes were filtered through Council oversight. Advanced technologies were partitioned behind layers of access protocols. Information arrived incomplete, curated, safe. To any compliant species, it would have felt like guidance. To humanity, it was a boundary. They did not challenge it. They adapted. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Human systems adjusted to reduced supply chains with expected inefficiencies. Production slowed, then stabilized. Their early interstellar projects remained modest, contained within the parameters allowed to them. From the Council's vantage point, the strategy was working. Containment through dependency. But the data did not settle. Human manufacturing began compensating in ways that were not requested and not taught. Where materials were restricted, substitutes emerged. Not equivalent, not elegant, but functional. Where processes were incomplete, humans filled the gaps with approximations that should have failed. They didn't. Instead of optimizing for perfection, humans optimized for outcome. Observers noted that their solutions often violated established design logic. Systems were overbuilt in some areas, dangerously simplified in others. Redundancies appeared where none were required. Fail-safes were improvised rather than engineered. And yet their systems held. Not flawlessly, but reliably enough to continue scaling. A logistics report highlighted the first major anomaly. Human cargo networks, operating under restricted routes, began outperforming projections. They moved more with less. They rerouted without central authorization. They compensated for delays before they occurred. No directive explained it. When analyzed, the answer was unsettlingly simple. They were not following the system, they were working around it. The Council dismissed it as inefficiency masked by effort. Increased labor could simulate effectiveness, but it was not sustainable. That assumption lasted 12 cycles. Then human output increased again. Not marginally. Exponentially. The source was traced back to decentralized innovation clusters. Small groups scattered across their territories, iterating rapidly. No unified design philosophy. No adherence to galactic standards. Just constant adjustment. Failures were frequent. They did not slow them down. Each failure fed the next iteration. Each limitation became a variable to exploit. Humans did not avoid constraints, they used them as starting points. A Council engineer reviewing captured schematics summarized it bluntly. They are solving problems we did not present. Still, the official stance did not change. Humanity was adapting, but only within the cage provided to them. Then the trade reports shifted. Species previously indifferent to humans began engaging more frequently. Not formally, not through Council channels, but through minor exchanges. Independent contractors, peripheral civilizations, fringe networks, those who operated outside strict oversight. Human presence expanded quietly. They offered solutions others overlooked. Repair techniques, logistical shortcuts, unconventional strategies. Nothing revolutionary, but consistently effective. They became useful. Usefulness spread faster than authority could track. The Council responded by tightening restrictions. Access windows narrowed. Data streams slowed. Oversight increased. Human progress did not. If anything, it became less visible. Their systems grew more opaque. External dependence appeared to decrease. Internal networks became harder to map. Where once their development could be monitored directly, now it had to be inferred. That was new. A contained species should not become harder to observe. Concern surfaced, but cautiously. No one wanted to escalate based on incomplete data. The Council had seen anomalies before. Most corrected themselves. Humanity did not. A predictive model was commissioned to assess long-term outcomes under continued restriction. It ran through thousands of scenarios, adjusting for variables the Council believed relevant. The results converged on a single conclusion. Human systems did not collapse under pressure. They restructured. Not in ways that aligned with galactic norms. Not in ways that could be easily predicted. But consistently, persistently, they found paths forward. The model flagged a threshold. If restrictions remained in place, human independence would not decrease, it would accelerate. The report was circulated, reviewed, and ultimately downplayed. Because the premise itself felt flawed. A species without access to full resources should not outgrow its limitations. That was a constant. That was understood. And yet the data refused to comply. In a final assessment appended to the report, a senior analyst added a single line. No emphasis. No recommendation. Just observation. If this is them constrained, projection beyond constraint is not advised. The failure began as a cascade no one had modeled. A peripheral trade network stalled without warning. Routing algorithms locked into recursive loops. Cargo drifted between nodes with no confirmed destination. At first, it was dismissed as a localized disruption. Systems like this had redundancies. They corrected themselves. This one didn't. Within hours, adjacent networks began to destabilize. Shared dependencies triggered secondary failures. Communication relays lagged, then desynchronized entirely. Data arrived out of order or not at all. What should have been contained spread outward, touching sectors that had no direct connection to the origin point. The Council initiated standard response protocols. They slowed the system. That made it worse. Automated corrections relied on stable inputs. Slowing the flow introduced gaps the system could not reconcile. Conflicting data accumulated faster than it could be processed. Entire segments froze, waiting for verification that would never arrive. For the first time in centuries, the network that connected the galaxy to itself began to fracture. Emergency directives were issued, layered with approvals, counterchecks, and hierarchical validation. Each action required confirmation from multiple nodes. Each delay compounded the instability. Nothing moved fast enough. Independent species attempted localized fixes, but their efforts clashed with central protocols. Solutions that worked in isolation created new conflicts at scale. The more they tried to stabilize the system, the more unpredictable it became. The structure that had ensured order was now amplifying failure. Human systems were affected, but not immobilized. Their networks did not freeze. They rerouted. Not through approved channels, not within defined parameters, but through pathways that did not exist in the Council's models. They abandoned non-essential data, prioritized movement over verification, and accepted partial accuracy over total certainty. It should have introduced chaos. Instead, it restored function. Human cargo began arriving where it was needed, not where it was scheduled. Supplies reached sectors that had gone silent. Communication resumed, fragmented but usable. Their signals were inconsistent, sometimes incomplete, but they carried intent. Other species noticed. At first, they resisted. Human methods violated every principle of system integrity. There were no guarantees, no safeguards, no oversight. It was unreliable. Then it worked. A transport convoy stranded between failing nodes accepted human routing instructions. It arrived. Not on time, not precisely where expected, but intact. That was enough. More followed. Human protocols spread without authorization. They were copied, modified, adapted by those desperate enough to try anything. Structured networks gave way to flexible ones. Rigid pathways were replaced with dynamic routing decisions made in real time. The system stopped collapsing. It changed. The Council attempted to reassert control. They issued corrections, reinstated protocols, demanded compliance. Their directives were ignored. Not out of defiance, but irrelevance. By the time their commands reached affected sectors, conditions had already shifted. Humans had already moved, adjusted, compensated. Their response cycle was faster because it did not wait for permission. They operated on immediacy. Observers began compiling reports, and for the first time, the tone changed. Human behavior was no longer described as inconsistent. It was described as effective. They did not aim for stability as defined by the Council. They aimed for continuity. If a system could not be preserved, they replaced it mid-operation. If data could not be verified, they acted on probability. If coordination failed, they decentralized entirely. They treated uncertainty as a constant, not a problem. Within cycles, the crisis stabilized. Not restored to its original form, but functional enough to sustain itself. Trade resumed in altered patterns. Communication normalized at reduced precision. The network survived. But it was no longer the same system the Council had built. Analysis revealed the extent of the shift. Human intervention had not repaired the structure. It had bypassed it. Entire layers of oversight had become unnecessary. Processes once considered essential were now optional. The galaxy had continued operating without them. That realization unsettled more than the failure itself. Because it exposed the truth the Council had never considered. Their system was not the only way to maintain order. And it might not even be the most efficient. A high-level review was convened. Data was presented, projections recalculated, assumptions questioned. No consensus was reached. But one conclusion could not be dismissed. Humanity had acted without authority, without alignment, without adherence to established design. And they had succeeded. In the final summary, a senior council member recorded a statement that would circulate far beyond the chamber. We did not misunderstand their limitations. We misunderstood the absence of them. The offer was prepared with precision. Language calibrated to convey respect without surrendering authority. Terms structured to appear generous while preserving leverage. Access to restricted technologies, expanded trade privileges, permanent representation within the Council's upper tier. No species had ever been elevated so quickly. No species had ever earned it through disruption. The message was clear. Join fully, and the system will make space for you. Privately, the intent was less generous. Integration would standardize humanity. Their methods would be regulated, their innovations filtered through established frameworks. Their unpredictability would be reduced to manageable variance. Control, presented as recognition. The transmission was delivered across all human channels simultaneously. No fragmentation this time, no overlapping voices. The Council expected a unified response. What they received was something else. Silence. Not refusal. Not hesitation. Just absence. For several cycles, no acknowledgement was returned. Human networks remained active, but the offer was not publicly discussed, not debated, not even referenced. It was as if the message had been received, processed, and set aside. The Council interpreted the delay as internal conflict. A divided species would struggle with a decision of this magnitude. That assumption held until the first reply arrived. It was brief. No formalities. No negotiation. No counterterms. They declined. Not the resources. Not the access. The structure itself. The response did not frame it as rejection of the Council, but as a refusal to participate in a system that required alignment over autonomy. They acknowledged the offer's value, recognized its intent, and dismissed its necessity. They did not need elevation. They did not require validation. They were already operating beyond the limits the system imposed. The Council reviewed the message repeatedly, searching for subtext, for hidden conditions, for leverage points. There were none. This was not posturing. Not strategic delay. Not an attempt to renegotiate from a stronger position. It was a decision. For the first time since its formation, the Council encountered something it could not process through precedent. Every species sought inclusion. Every civilization, at some stage, recognized the advantage of alignment with a greater structure. Even those that resisted eventually integrated, drawn by stability, security, and shared advancement. Humanity stepped away from it. The implications spread quickly. If a species could refuse integration without collapsing, then dependency was not absolute. If a system could be declined without consequence, then its authority was not universal. The Council moved to respond. Secondary offers were drafted, more flexible, less restrictive. Oversight clauses softened. Access expanded further. Quiet concessions were made in language that had never been altered before. Humanity did not engage. Instead, their presence within shared systems began to recede. Trade volumes decreased, not abruptly, but steadily. Collaborative projects reached completion and were not renewed. Joint operations concluded without extension. Communication channels remained open, but traffic diminished. They were not severing ties. They were withdrawing reliance. Other species noticed the shift before the Council acknowledged it. Networks that had come to depend on human adaptability felt the absence immediately. Processes that had been stabilized through their intervention began to strain under traditional methods. Requests were sent. Clarifications sought. Humans responded selectively, offering assistance where it aligned with their own priorities, ignoring what did not. There was no hostility, no declaration of separation. Just choice. The Council attempted to reassert influence through indirect pressure. Access to certain resources was restricted. Peripheral allies were encouraged to limit engagement. Subtle barriers were introduced, designed to remind humanity of the advantages they were relinquishing. It had no measurable effect. Human systems adjusted as they always had, by finding alternatives. Where access closed, substitutes appeared. Where pathways narrowed, new routes formed. The same pattern repeated, but now without even the pretense of compliance. Containment no longer applied. A final internal assessment was commissioned, not for strategy, but for understanding. It concluded with a statement that carried no recommendation, only recognition. Humanity did not reject the system because it lacked value. They rejected it because they did not need it. The Council had offered them a place at the center. Humanity chose distance instead. And in doing so, redefined what power looked like. At first, the galaxy expected retaliation. A species that refused elevation should have sought dominance elsewhere. History supported that pattern. Withdrawal usually preceded expansion, and expansion inevitably led to confrontation. The Council monitored border regions, trade corridors, and unclaimed sectors for signs of mobilization. None appeared. Human fleets did not mass at contested systems. Their signals did not spike with military encryption. There were no declarations, no alliances forged in secrecy. Instead, their transmissions thinned. Shared databases updated less frequently. Joint research streams went quiet. They were not preparing for war. They were disengaging. The consequences were immediate but subtle. Sectors that had relied on human logistical models began experiencing delays. Not catastrophic failures, just inefficiencies that accumulated over time. Routing reverted to older protocols. Response cycles lengthened. Minor shortages resurfaced in regions that had grown accustomed to fluid supply. The system continued to function. It simply felt heavier. Independent civilizations attempted to maintain informal contact. Some succeeded, receiving limited trade agreements or targeted technical assistance. Others received no response at all. Human priorities were no longer visible to the broader network. Their movements were harder to trace, their development harder to measure. They had become opaque. Rumors filled the absence. Exploration vessels reported glimpses of new infrastructure in distant sectors, structures not registered in Council archives. Signals detected beyond mapped territories suggested expansion, but not toward established power centers. Human trajectories pointed outward, not inward. They were not carving space from the galaxy. They were building beyond it. The Council convened emergency analyses, projecting potential outcomes. None aligned with precedent. A species that possessed capability yet declined control disrupted every predictive model. Influence without participation created instability of a different kind, psychological rather than structural. Authority relies on relevance. Humanity had made itself optional. In chambers where certainty once reigned, doubt took root. If a civilization could thrive independently of the central framework, others might question their own alignment. The Council's strength had never depended solely on force, it depended on inevitability. Membership was considered the logical endpoint of progress. Now, that endpoint was negotiable. Smaller species began reevaluating treaties. Not abandoning them, but renegotiating terms with newfound confidence. They had seen proof that alternatives existed. The Council adjusted policies to compensate, loosening restrictions preemptively to prevent further erosion of influence. It was the first time concessions were made without crisis. Meanwhile, humanity did not broadcast achievements. They did not announce breakthroughs or claim superiority. Their absence spoke louder than any declaration could have. Every advancement they achieved beyond the Council's view reinforced a single message: participation was a choice, not a necessity. Exploratory probes sent to chart human expansion returned incomplete data. Infrastructure appeared modular, decentralized, designed to operate without centralized oversight. Energy signatures suggested efficiency beyond earlier models. Communication patterns indicated adaptive networks that could fragment and reassemble without loss of continuity. They had refined what they demonstrated during the crisis. Flexibility had become foundation. A final attempt at re-engagement was authorized. Not an offer of integration, not a demand for compliance, an invitation to dialogue as equals. The transmission was transmitted across long-range channels, carefully composed to avoid implication of authority. The reply arrived after an extended delay. It contained no hostility, no triumph. Just clarity. Humanity would remain cooperative where interests aligned. They would remain distant where they did not. They bore no grievance, held no ambition to govern, and sought no confrontation. They simply preferred self-determination. The message ended without signature. Across the galaxy, reactions varied. Some interpreted it as restraint. Others as latent threat. Many as quiet confidence. What unsettled the Council most was not what humanity might do, but what they chose not to do. They had the capacity to dominate weakened systems. They declined. They had the leverage to destabilize authority. They refrained. Power exercised sparingly is harder to measure than power displayed. In the years that followed, humanity's name shifted in tone. Once dismissed, then scrutinized, now spoken with a mixture of respect and caution. Not rulers. Not rebels. Something less familiar. A benchmark. The galaxy had prepared for conquest, for rebellion, for rivalry. It had not prepared to be deemed unnecessary. And that was what made it tremble.